I know this is a little bit before when we typically start live, but it is before your last schedule. So appreciate you guys showing up. We have a special guest here today that I invited. I met Jed the first couple weeks I was here at a function over at the foundation. We just started talking, and he put me in on this 48 fall and 48 pound. More recently, I had an opportunity to see some of his work. But for those of you who don't know, Colonel Mike McDermott, local guy, big supporter of the program. Actually, ironically served with his son in combat, but served in the Vietnam War. He recently handed over all of his Vietnam era pictures to the Texas Tech Library through the library here. So I only bring that up to encourage you guys that if you don't know, it's the 50th commemoration of the Vietnam War, and all those vets that served in combat in Vietnam, they do not get the level of respect that your cadre and myself got when we came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, that you guys will see when you go overseas and you return. They were, quite frankly, disrespected. But Texas Tech has this single repository of Vietnam history that Colonel Mike McDermott donated to. But Jed here, in addition to that project with Mike McDermott, has done a lot of research into the World War I veterans that went to K-State. Now, this is your program. This is Kansas State University. I'm not a graduate of Kansas State University. Okay, but it's important to me. It should be important to you. This is your history. This is what you guys are about. And you should be proud. And you should know some of the stories. Nobody's going to be as squared away as Mr. Dunham here and know all the stories of 48 people. Okay, he's very passionate about it. And I appreciate that, because you want to feel like when you have military service that regardless of what you did or didn't do, that somebody appreciates what you did. Okay, and Mr. Dunham went back and found the stories of these 48 fallen from K-State. All right, so I would encourage you to appreciate those that went before you. And it just so happens that we're going to talk specifically about the World War I vets today. But you really should look at your history. This is your history. This is K-State's history. So it should be very important to you, and a very important part of history that was maybe lost a little bit. And Mr. Dunham here tracked down for us. So please give me your undivided attention. If we have the opportunity to ask questions, because he knows no detail about these stories. So that being said, please give me your undivided attention, and sir, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I really do. This comes from my heart, and this is a story that I think that you will all find, at different levels, fascinating, inspiring, and possibly a little bit chilling. So I'll begin. I'm going to say that this is a story about the First World War, and if we were to hold 1 second of silence for every death caused by the First World War, it would require us to remain quiet for 162 days. Just let that kind of sink in a little bit there. There's a lot of statistics and a lot of things and a lot of numbers that can fog your mind and blow it away. But today we're going to talk about 48 of those seconds and what they can teach us today. So as I said, thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with you today. The story is called 48 Fallen, 48 Found. It's the story of Kansas State University students who went to the war and never came back. So a brief introduction about me. My name is Jed Dunham. I'm a 1996 graduate of Kansas State University. And while I was here, while I'm very proud of my academic degree, I have to be honest that when I was a student here, that was not where I placed my passion and energy. I did play lacrosse while I was here. That's what I got into. And that's what continued to bring me back through the years ever since. Coming back for reunions, coming back to see the other things, lacrosse is what I was a part of. To that, 2 years ago I came back for a reunion. And I'm walking into Memorial Stadium, a place that I'd always referred to as Old Stadium when I played here. And I was walking in, if we can get the next slide there, please. And I was walking in the stadium that day, and something just happened. When the sun hit me, clap or whatnot, but I was just, boom, something hit me, and I took a quick picture. And I didn't think much about it. I had a great weekend, saw everybody and whatnot, and I went back to New Hampshire, where I'm from, and I was flipping through the photographs. It's the fall of 2014, so the First World War was entering into its 100-year centennial. You know, the celebrations from Europe were kind of filtering through the BBC news and what. But I got to this picture and I was like, huh, who are these guys? What do they do? And I thought it would be just a very simple, you know, great faith in the internet and the Google machine, and just drop it in there, think it very quickly. You know, my curiosity would be satisfied. Nothing came back. I'm like, what's going on here? And I started taking each individual name, dropping them into multiple search engines, multiple websites. Nothing. All 48 of them had vanished without a trace. And it's just, I was like, what is going on here? And I went back and looked at the picture again. It says, Memorial Stadium, in remembrance of those from this college who gave their lives in World War I, 1917, 1918. I said, World War I? How do we have a World War I if there's not a World War II? When was this plaque put on? What is going on? And curiosity bit me. And I went down the rabbit hole and I said, I've got to find this out. This was something that just didn't sit right with me, that there was nothing left. And so I kept looking through, you know, the first way you try to find something doesn't solve your riddle, go around the flank, come around the other side. And I started to go through the libraries and different things I could find online. And I found a 1919 copy of the Royal Purple, K-State yearbook, you know, that had been on, you know, that was been archived on the internet. And I said, there's got to be something in here. I just started slowly clicking through pages. And this is where the clues came together, and this is where the mystery began to unravel. And I found in those pages of the Royal Purple a page where they had photographs of the individuals, had their dates of birth, dates of death, hometowns, in some cases, you know, the military unit that they had served with. And these began to become the clues, which then led to the individual stories of all 48 K-State students who died in the First World War. And again, I tried this on pure personal curiosity, but I got done with this. I'm like, holy cow, this is far too important, far too fascinating for me to keep to myself. And so I started reaching out to K-State, you know, kind of peeling emails off the website, you know, emails lead to phone calls to conference calls. And I'm like, there's something here. And the old salesman in me was saying, if they're not saying no, they're just trying to find a way to say yes. And so I'm like, I'm going to go out to K-State. It just so happened, you know, for fate of the world, that I was in the middle of a career change at the moment, which had, you know, was a polite way of saying I was unemployed. So I was like, hey, nothing to lose. Throw the duffel bags in the car, and I rolled out to Kansas. And I got here, and we slowly put this project together. And we found that these stories are not unique just to Kansas State University, but what these 48 individuals who did not survive the First World War have been able to teach us is the entire American experience of the First World War, part of history which unfortunately has been lost. And if we could get the next slide there, please. So, before we get deep into the 48th Fall, I'm going to give you a real brief overview of World War I history. All right, now like I said, I'm a bit of a historian, I can go deep. Got to tread lightly on this one here, okay? Because there have been millions of volumes and movies and documents, anything you want about the First World War has been written. But the best way I've ever heard it explained was through a little internet meme I saw circulating a couple years ago. And it was, imagine the First World War if it was a bar fight. So very quickly here, in 30 seconds, we're going to explain World War I. But just imagine, if you will, prior to the outbreak of the war, Europe was kind of mingling in the bars. It's the end of the week, everybody's having a nice little cocktail, things are having great. You know, the Germans are singing their marching songs. Britain's talking about politics over here. You know, France trying to make moves on Italy, who knows. But at some point in this, Serbia bumps into Austria-Hungary, the old empire, knocks a drink, spills it on their pants. And Austria's like, what's this? And Serbia says, I would apologize. You know, we offered to pay for the dry cleaning. They're like, that's not going to be good enough. I need a new pair of pants. Before you know it, people start taking sides. The big brothers in Russia start, you know, Europe started coming over. You know, Russia's looking over them. You know, problem here? You know, Germany's like, what's going on? Before you know it, people are starting to line up and thinking about what happened. And all of a sudden, Germany reaches back and punches France in the face, knocks it right through the window, out into the street. Russia jumps in, tries to fly over a table, misses dramatically, crashes. They're out of the picture. Britain's all offended, and before you know it, it is an absolute chaotic nightmare of violence. And right about that time, America's walking down the street, looks in, says, hey, comes on in the door, grabs a bar stool, smashes it over Germany's head, raises our hands in victory. France and Britain go through the pockets and they buy everybody around. And that's kind of the First World War. All right? As we say the First World War, we have these images, the mud, the trench. Get the next slide there, please. Oh. As we go through, you know, as I said, the opening event here was the assassination. Like I said, we're kind of done with the history part of it, but next slide, please. But we know about World War I because it is just this incredible drama of violence. And the artillery, the mud, the gas, was just an insane part of our human history. The part that, before it was World War I, it was known as the Great War, and then the European War. And then when America and the rest of the world kind of came in towards the end, it was known as the World War. Let me get the next slide, please. And the World War gave us all kinds of new things. The tanks, the machine gun, the aircraft, artillery like we couldn't imagine. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, chemical warfare. And I don't know if there's any more tragic image of a young child wearing a gas mask. But that's what the World War is. And in our memory, it's kind of how we envision it. But remember, we get to this part where America comes in and smashes the bar stool over the head of Germany. The part that's never really been told. And if we can get that slide, please. And this is what the 48 Fallen have given us almost 100 years beyond their death, is the story of the American experience in the First World War. And so as we went back and saw that picture of the plaque, and all those names on there, one of the first things that I did, I kind of had this image that, well, hey, they all died in alphabetical order. How about that? Obviously, that's not the case. Each one of them had a very different experience through the war. Each one of them had a very different perspective of it. But one of them was a man named Willis Comfort. And Willis Comfort was a 1914 graduate of Kansas State Agricultural College, as it was known then. And Willis was, like many of the people in this era, he was an eyewitness to history. We hear that again and again. And you will be eyewitnesses to history. You will see things in your life, in your careers, in your experience, that are going to be hard for the rest of us to imagine. So imagine here now, Willis Comfort, he was a school teacher before he was a student, came here, became an engineering student, graduated, went to Washington, D.C., was part of this new, part of the land, the Bureau of Land Management, I believe it was, but they were building roads. Imagine 1914, 1916, we don't have a lot of roads in the country. And he's out there building roads, and right around the time, 1916, summer of 1916, there's an event that happens on the southern border with, you might have heard, Pancho Villa, the Mexican expedition. We're not going to get into that, but Willis Comfort joins the National Guard. And he's sent down to Texas to kind of partake in this punitive expedition into Mexico. Something about the military appealed to him. And when he was done, put his career as a road builder on hold. He joined the United States Army and was commissioned as an officer in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and was sent back down to the border and was made a member of the 16th Infantry Regiment. And that's where they were, kind of quietly hanging out. Everything was cool, was just kind of keeping the peace. When in January 1917, the European War grew into the World War. And there's so many different elements to history that I love. It's the little personalities, it's the who's in the room when the decisions happen and such. But the event that brought America into the war, because America was not ours. We had no interest in it. We could have been allies to Germany, allies to France, it didn't matter. We were making money on both sides of the table. But Germany at the time was almost, they were almost at the brink of extinction. And they unleashed this thing we call submarine warfare. You may have heard of that. And it was bad. Well, through that, the United States had a couple of, they're kind of, a couple of ships are going down, things are getting a little excited. And Germany realizes that, hey, if we could, these guys are going to get in here sooner or later. We better partner up and figure out a way to prevent some of this happening. So they get involved with Mexico and they say, hey, how'd you guys like to have those 3 states back that you wanted to have, that you went to war with last year about? Come in with us, make war against America, we'll be allies, everything will be great. Well, unfortunately, this is a little twist in history that kind of happened. England had tapped into the transatlantic cable, which is literally the cable, about this big around, went underneath the ocean. And the American cable had a channel between Germany and Mexico and such, because if there any peace agreements were going to, have the cable on. Well, England had tapped into it, and England had already broken the German code, and they intercept this message about, hey, let's go make war against America, you guys be partners. And they're like, whoa, hot ticket. But they couldn't just let it out and kind of let it be public, because they didn't want the Germans to know. They figured out what their code was, and they certainly didn't want the Americans to know that we were already tapped into their secret communications. A little bit tricky. So they take that message, that change in history moment, they put it in a safe, buried behind the War Department for a couple of months, until they find this ship that they conveniently lassoed in the North Sea or whatnot. They say, we found this message in the ship. You know, that's how history works. It's not always what was seen on the front page. But that message then gets put out to the Americans. It goes back to the United States. Woodrow Wilson reads it. He's apoplectic about it. But on that is that Zimmerman telegram is the cause of the American entry into the First World War. And so in April 1917, Wilson goes to Congress and he gets the declaration of war. But he goes back to the White House. He's a peaceful guy, all accounts. And he's standing there with his aide. He says, I can't believe they applauded that speech tonight. That was a speech that sent many of our boys to their deaths. And he turned and put his head on the mantelpiece by the fireplace and he wept. It's almost as if he kind of could see something coming. Something that the rest of the country, certainly the rest of the world, couldn't see, because when America declares war in 1917, no one knows what that means. We don't have a standing army that's all that large. Maybe 100,000 guys in the Federal Army. Maybe 100,000 more we can find from the National Guard. That's it. We're using weapons that are antiquated by the modern era standards. We don't know how to communicate beyond a regimental level, how to have the infantry talk to the artillery, how to have the aircraft that's going around. At the time, there's maybe only 300 people in the entire United States who knew how to fly an aircraft. We were a fringe power, scoffed at by the Europeans. So when we go into war, no one knows what that means. But the message goes down to the southern border, the 16th Infantry Regiment, along with the 18th, 26th, 28th. They say, you're going overseas, we've got to show them something. And they send them up to the river, up to Hoboken, New Jersey, on midnight trains. And they're one of the first guys to go to France. Willis Comfort actually was in the first convoy that arrived in France on 26th of June, 1917. Became a member of what was now known as the 1st Infantry Division. It's called the 1st Infantry Division, but it was the 1st Division. That was what its name was originally, the American Expeditionary Forces. The 1st Division. 1st Division, so that was the first group of guys we put together. That's how they got their name. And as I said, at the time, the American Army, we couldn't communicate. We didn't know what was going on. And so we became part of the French Army. And this book right here, I'll get into a little bit later, but this is a French documents that have been translated, apparently never read, but the 1st Division was part of the French. And they go through their training. If we get the next slide, please. So Willis Comfort, again, I said he was one of these eyewitnesses to history, saw these things firsthand. His unit, 2nd Battalion of the 16th Infantry, gets picked to parade in Paris on July 4th, 1917. Show of brotherhood with the French. France at this point has been bled white. There's nothing left. They are at the end of their rope. So it's not a happy parade, not a happy occasion. Many of the people that talked about this were kind of shocked by the silence of the French crowds as they went by, because the French knew what they were getting into. And an entire generation of Frenchmen were gone by war. So this is, but Willis Comfort was there. Marches through Paris with the 16th Infantry. Get the next slide, please. And later that summer, they go through their training. They learn how to throw hand grenades, how to charge a machine gun nest, how to do all kinds of things. Again, Americans we didn't have a trained military that operated on the sense of the new scale that was going on in Europe. By this point, Europe was used to losing hundreds of thousands of casualties per battle. These battles would go on for weeks, months at a time. The British, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, 19,247 British soldiers killed in a day. Killed in a day. And here come the Americans with a couple thousand guys. Well, they get trained, and they're getting loaded up quick. It's like, hey, things are happening. And in November 1917, Willis Comfort with the 16th Infantry and every time they get sent up to the trench, it's a quiet sector, and they're going to be there and just kind of get used to the mud and the filth, and the horrors of that. It's, like I said, a quiet sector. Well, the night they arrive, it's downpour, rain, just miserable conditions. And the Germans, they were not aware that the Americans were going to come up there, but they had this raid plan. And raids at the time, they'd come across there, get prisoners, get the information. And this is a map that's in a German document that's been translated, obviously. But this is the map of the first raid. It's an event that happened in 1917. But when the Germans came through, they had a massive artillery barrage that no one could get in or out of, sealed off that little unit. They ran through this, and reading these reports, it's like reading SEAL Team 6. Everyone on that, those 237 Germans, each one of them had a mission. You know, the first guy, take out the first guy. Second guy, pick up his gun. That, I mean, just a very detailed and trained and well-placed superior superior military force. And like I said, I gave you a 2-week class on this alone. This is literally, it's like watching special forces being born. And this particular raid, 3 Americans, if you get the next slide, please, were killed. First 3 Americans killed in the First World War, a war that would eventually cost us 116,000 deaths. The first 3, Thomas Enright, Corporal Grisham, and Private Merle Hay, belonged to Willis Comfort Company, Company F, 16th Infantry. And this particular event catalyzed the United States feeling back home. At the time, there was no news from the front. No one knew. You know, General Pershing, the commander of all troops out there, said, hey, I don't want any specific units being named. And so everybody wanted to know, what's going on? What's happening over there? And then the first 3 soldiers are killed. And they're made national heroes. They're made French heroes. Their names are broadcast. And even today, you know, streets are named after them. Monuments are placed and such. But the first 3 Americans killed in the war happened under Willis Comfort's command. And Willis, Captain Comfort by this point, I'll get the next slide, please, continued to go on, fight with the 1st Division. The 1st Division became the footprint, the founding footprint of the modern American military. And that's something for all you first ID guys out here. Yes, it's the 1st Infantry Division, but beyond that, it is the foundation of our modern American Army. And you see them as they go through their training, as they go through their orders, and they grow from regimental to corps to division, you know, all the way up on the line. As they gain responsibility, the 1st Division constantly stripping their guys away and sending them back to the States to get trained, or sending them to different units in France. The DNA of the American Army begun in the 1st Infantry Division. And Willis Comfort, one of the K-State's own, was a member of that division. And in July of 1918, a massive a massive offensive, he was killed in action on July 18, 1918. He was wounded. He had an opportunity to leave the field. He decided not to. He wanted to stay with his men. And that's what I believe, the citation that grants him his award is very, sketchy on the actual details. But I believe it's the fact that he was wounded and had an opportunity to leave, but decided to say, no, I'm better off here with my guys. And he died on the field of combat. And for his actions that day, he was the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. And I want to say he was the first recipient of the Kansas State Agricultural College history. I'm not sure on that, but at the time, it was a medal that had just been in existence for a very brief amount of time, and he was one of the very first to receive it, for heroic action. But Willis Comfort died. A few years later, he was brought back. They had his funeral right downtown in Manhattan. He was, by this point, his family was in Manhattan. And they paraded his remains all the way up points. It was very touching and honorable. The entire community came out for it. And Willis Comfort today is buried in Sunset Cemetery, right up the road. And it's kind of strange, just like I said, through the eyes of one of the 48 fallen, we get this incredible story, the birth of the American military, and the first experiences of our involvement in the First World War. And that's just one. If we get the next slide, please. But let's go back a second. Okay, again, war is declared. There's a couple of guys, in 1917, war is declared. They ship a few of our guys in uniform overseas, but there's this enormous need to train an army, to train a massive army. And one of the places where they did this was a place called Camp Funston. I'm sure you're all familiar, you've heard that. Well, next time you go out to Fort Riley, and if you go through the Ogden gates, look to your left as you go by the rail yards, as you go by the monument out there, and imagine, if you will, a city of almost 70,000 people, built almost overnight. At its peak, they were finishing a building every 45 minutes. And so within about very few short weeks, 70,000 people have just moved into Fort Riley, and they're getting trained. They're learning how to, stuff bayonets into, saw bags and such like that. But again, we didn't have an army. We didn't know how to train an army. So the guys, as they're all, assembled together, who's going to be the sergeant? Well, you guys hang out over here. We got a group of trees over here. This guy's over here. You can yell through the trees, and these guys can understand what you said. You're the sergeant. That's how the Army was kind of built. But Camp Funston was one of several training facilities throughout the country. And Again, we think of the First World War, we think of the trenches, we think of the gas. Well, a lot of things that we don't think of is this thing called the influenza pandemic. Has anybody heard of that? Anybody got the flu before? Well, the influenza pandemic, as I said, we were to hold a moment of silence and cause us to be quiet for 162 days. Well, at the very tail end of the war, the influenza pandemic erupted across the globe and killed more humans in 12 weeks than the war did in 4 years. And that's a pretty crazy number. And what's even crazier is that patient 0 was out of Camp Funston. And they traced this pandemic back. They kind of figured out where it might have started. I think there's a couple of guys that went hunting outside of Dodge City, Kansas, shot a few of these infected birds. The bird flu went from animal to human, human to human, and then human to human airborne. These guys went up to Camp Funston in January of 1918, and all of a sudden, people are getting sick. And there's another guy on the wall named MacArthur Rush. And he was at Camp Funston at this time. And through his letters that he writes to his sister and his mother, you can hear and visualize this horror story going on. It's like, wow, everybody's sick. And they're cramming them in. There's not enough room in the hospital anymore. They don't know how disease spreads, so they're not too sure about washing hands or coughing on things. I mean, it's a very frightening experience. And then all of a sudden, people start dying. They start dying in droves. 10, 30, 40, 50 a night. And MacArthur Brush is writing these letters because he's been replaced from his training assignment to take care of some of the sick soldiers. And he writes to his sister, he says, I got to go home, I got to go take care of my babies, is what he called. So the lights are dim, we got to go make sure everybody's okay. And you see through these letters over a few progressive weeks how horrifying this influenza is becoming. And then all of a sudden, this last letter, it's a short one, and he's writing to his sister, he says, I don't feel so hot tonight. I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed early. And that's the last thing that he ever said. And so again, through the eyes of the 48 Fallen, we get this influenza pandemic. We know the big numbers. But then you get to see it in the eyes and the experience of the human people who were there. And so that's another story too. Let me keep going, please. Again, I say everybody on that plaque has a story. And they didn't die in alphabetical order. I actually forgot to take this slide out here, but this is an interesting story here because, again, as I was going through all these names, and by the time I was about halfway through, I had some tricks figured out. I knew where I could go to get the information I was looking for. But there's one name on the plaque, and it just kept hitting 0, 0, 0. And it's the second guy up there, Dylan Bates. I said, man, something's not right. Dylan's not out there. And it was almost like operating a Ouija board with a keyboard because you could almost feel the spirit saying, don't quit on me now. You're almost there. And I came across this piece of paper here on the right, which is a draft card, registration draft card. And I'm reading through it, and I look up at the top, and I say, Dylan. Well, now, I wonder if that name is actually, that D at the end of his name is an O. What if he's Delano? Mystery solved. Delano Bates comes to life. Well, Delano Bates made a sergeant in the Kansas National Guard. He died in appendicitis very early on. He didn't get to make it too far. Dylan Bates never existed. Delano Bates has a story, and he's buried down in Cottonwood Falls here today. But like I said, that was a slide I just kind of forgot to take out. We get the next one. Because again, how does this war happen? The war happens in chronological order. One of the things that I did when I was able to find all the different dates that people had died is I laid them all out on just one long chronological timeline, thinking that be evenly spaced here, evenly spaced there. And what turned out was that the first year of the war, nothing's happened. You might have an accident, you had Dylan Bates with appendicitis, Calvin Irwin got killed playing football in Hawaii, random events, but nothing major. The summer of 1918 happens, and all of a sudden it's as if a tidal wave. They all start to die. And as that summer goes on and turns into the fall in October of 1918, Armageddon. And I'm wondering what was going on. I mean, 3, 4 of these guys are dying in a day. What's going on? And again, we go back through the eyes of 48 Fallen, they tell us the story. So I want you to look at the guy in the first row, second from the left there, this one right here. His name is Edward Wells. Eddie Wells is kind of he's a very interesting character in this 48 Fallen because it's almost like through Eddie Wells, everybody knew Eddie. You get the little stories, you get the little, family, the unique stories through everyone. But everybody knew Eddie. When Eddie Wells came to Kansas State University, or Kansas State Agricultural College at the time, he was first team all Missouri Valley Conference football player and basketball player. You know, he was the first Aggie Wildcat. He was the guy that would will his team to win. Everybody on campus knew of Eddie Wells. He's always in the newspaper. He was the president of the Sigma Nu fraternity. He was a happening guy. His freshman basketball team beat the senior basketball team. You know, something about that iron will. You go back and read through the line scores on that. And Eddie Wells, he might give you 4 fouls a game. He might not score a point, but I can not bring that ball down the lane on that guy, apparently. And his football playing was even to surpass that. You know, they said when he went down to Oklahoma University, he single-handedly carried the team to victory that day, and the entire crowd in Norman rose up on their feet and gave him a Wildcat ovation. You know, so everybody knew Eddie. When the war breaks out, hey, you're going to join in, you're going to do this and whatnot. It's a big adventure. You know, hey, we'll break from the pace on the farm or back here. Sure, jump in. Nobody knew what it was going to be. But Eddie Wells goes in, and we get the next slide, please. And he's made an officer. He takes the first officer's training class out of Fort Riley. And he's commissioned as a lieutenant. He joins the National Guard. He's made a member of the 42nd Division. That's the Rainbow Division, you know, all across the country. Cobbled together, sent over to France. And while Eddie's in France, he's writing letters back, and they're publishing them in the Collegian. You know, hey, Eddie's, you know, he was made a town major, which is a way of, you know, millions of Americans are coming into France. Where are you going to put them? Well, you put them in the barnyards, you put them in the farmhouses and such. And it required an American to kind of be there to negotiate things with the local French mayor and such. And that was one of Eddie's first jobs through that winter of 1917, 1918. And he's writing these letters back home. You kind of get the sense of his humor and his flavor, because he's like, you know, I'm over here and I got to share an office with the French mayor. You know, he doesn't speak English and I don't speak French, so we get along great. You know, and he has this, you know, you get this sense of, hey, there's someone overall kind of invested with Eddie. And he writes back again after he's had his little first experience up at the front and seen some of the filth. And he writes back and says, you know, I came back to my bunker and I was really tired. I wanted to go to sleep. I wanted nothing more than to fall asleep, but someone had left a little pile of letters on my bunk. And I couldn't go to sleep until I read each and every one of them. You get that sense. You know, this communication. It's not email. You know, it's not Skyping. But there is a connection. And everybody's kind of following Eddie along. And as I said, you know, that first part of it is a grand adventure. No one's getting hurt yet. But then in September 1918, there's a massive American offensive, the St. Mihiel offensive. And in the opening drive, boom, the shell goes off, sliver of shrapnel hits Eddie in the gut. And there's a little blurb that's written about him in his regimental diary at the end. It says, Eddie Wells, the great football star, was knocked to the field, and he couldn't rise again. Eddie Wells died in France. And when that moment, when that news was sent back to the United States, first to his mother in Wichita, then a cable came up through the night from Saturday to Sunday. On Monday morning, it's front page news in the Collegian and the Mercury. Everybody at that point had a casualty. And Eddie Wells' death was something that truly put the reality of what was going on in Europe together. This is in September, and before you know it, the horrors of late September and October and November, the conclusion of the war began. And if I get the next slide, please. And we lost a lot of people. You know, we lost a lot of Americans over there, especially in that last concentrated 6 weeks of the war. The Meuse-Argonne offensive killed 26,000 Americans in about 6 weeks. And when you read the diaries, and you read the accounts, you see some of the images, you look at the maps they're going through, and you see the intensity of the horror that these guys were experiencing. You really get a sense of, wow, there was something about the First World War that as Americans, we haven't really had a chance to truly understand. And when you read these accounts, and you look at them, and you see, like I said, I'm a little bit of a nut, so I'll take some of the old stuff and then go back and look at Google Earth and kind of match up where they went. And some of these areas today are still so saturated with chemical weapons that they're off limits to the French themselves. These battlefields are still dangerous today. And again, like I say, all of a sudden, tack on the influenza pandemic, tack on all the other things that are happening, and Americans are coming back there. And at the time, if we get the next slide, please. When you died, it was not like, it wasn't as it is today, where you're dead and immediately you're removed back. No, they were buried in temporary graves. And that photograph I showed you just earlier with all the caskets, that was taken in 1922, when all the bodies were being exhumed from the temporary graveyards in France. And the Americans had an opportunity, hey, if your son, your brother, your father wants to come back, we can make that happen. So about half the casualties came back. The others are still in France today. They were reinterred in some beautiful cemeteries over there. But when these guys came back, like Eddie Wells did, came on the harbor of New York and shipped out on a train, and he's now buried in Downs, Kansas today, kind of in western Kansas. And as you can see that photograph there, I know you guys see that Wildcat hat, and I obviously took that photograph. There was a picture that I took earlier when I was looking for another 48 Fallen on walking through Arlington Cemetery. It was right around Christmas. The wreaths were on the stones. It's very beautiful, very kind of overcast and kind of wet, chilly. And I had that hat on for some reason, and I found the one guy I was looking for, Captain Willis Pierce, and buried in the far end of the cemetery. Back where they don't bury him in rows. He was on this little hillside. And it was apparent, obviously, no one had come to see Willis for quite a while. I saw his grave there, and it was just this kind of a spiritual connection, that I felt from our university, from, him, and like we found him, not forgotten. And it was a spontaneous kind of thing. I just took the hat off and put it on the gravestone and took a picture of it, and I kind of liked the way it looked. And so I kind of dedicated another slide project to this, to visit each one of these graves. And to take the Wildcat hat with them, and to let them know that you're not forgotten. And again, I just want to pause real quickly too. I never served. I have no intention to serve. I'm a civilian from the Corps. Okay? And as Colonel was saying earlier, it is important for you to know that part of your service to this nation is that there is a population of us that is left behind, that truly appreciates and truly honors what it is you've sacrificed yourself to do. You've sacrificed your freedoms right off the bat because you serve in something greater than yourself. You have obligations that the rest of us in civilian life do not have. And there's something truly deeply honorable about that. And you should all know that and carry that with you in your heart. But also know that there are those of us on our side of the street that respect that from you. And we'll do whatever it takes to continue to make sure that you are remembered. And when we say not forgotten, we mean what we say. If you get the next slide, please. So again, there's the grave of Willis Pierce. His story, again, we don't really have time to go through it right now, but that's another one that is just an absolutely heartwarming, dramatic story. He served with the National Guard unit out of Oklahoma, and like I said, his story is quite fascinating as well. Emery Baird from Topeka, that's where he is today. He served in the 7th Infantry, was drafted, didn't want to go. The last photograph of him was leaving Topeka with the rest of his friends, all guys the same age, taking the train to Camp Funston. And they're all kind of, rather be doing something else. Something else to be reminded of. Not everybody enlisted. Not everybody went willingly. Not everybody felt the same cause. Certainly there was a tremendous amount of patriotism, a tremendous amount of, yes, let's go serve something. There was also a great sense of adventure. Let's get off the farm. Let's go out there and do something. But there's also a large percentage, some of these guys on the plaque, who were pulled from their families without they didn't want to go. There's a guy like George Wingate, won't go too deep into him right now, but George Wingate was sent overseas. He had a dog that he never saw. And it wasn't his fight, he just wanted to farm and off. But he went overseas, and he was killed. And as the war was over, they'd already had the funeral. They already kind of, laid a little, marking, a little memorial. The news would come back and he was killed with another Ogden native. But when the war was over, hey, this Ogden guy was found in a German prisoner of war camp. So there's this great surge of, oh wow, maybe George is still alive. Because they never sent the clothes back, which is what they did when someone was killed. There's hope. And it's one of the saddest stories of this entire 48 because there is no happy ending there. George Wingate was killed. He never did come back. But there's almost that second sense of loss. Like, oh, that hope is rekindled and then dashed again. Get the next slide, please. And then again, kind of ironic, these stories the 48 Fallen go through. This is a guy named Ernest Dorland. Again, he's also buried at Sunset Cemetery, which is kind of strange. It's not more than 100 yards from Willis Comfort. And Willis Comfort went all the way over to France. All the guys, he was like the farthest east, or the farthest west, to die. And Ernest Dorland was in Siberia and went all the way over there and died in the Philippines on the way back. But I didn't even know that the Americans were in Siberia. And that's a whole crazy story right there, fighting armored trains in the Russian Revolution. What the heck? But as we go through it, next slide, please. So, again, let's go back to Eddie Wells now. Eddie Wells, news comes back to Manhattan, Eddie Wells is dead. And along with 47 other K-Staters. Now, they didn't all graduate from K-State. They didn't all, you know, one of them was a teacher, one of them was, you know, some of them graduated, some of them were just here for what they call the short courses and such. Some of them were current students, left their classes and went overseas. But when they didn't come back, there was a great need to remember them. And thus began the project where you combine a memorial with an athletic need, and we needed to upgrade the football facilities. And so why not make the new stadium a memorial as well? This was something a lot of universities, a lot of colleges throughout the country were doing. You know, Nebraska still plays the World War I Memorial Stadium. I believe Oklahoma does as well. And here in Manhattan, there was this need, this call to unite the need for a memorial with that of a stadium. And thus began this beautiful concept called Memorial Stadium. And this is where we're going to kind of wrap things up here, because as you can see, that's not really what we see down on the other side of campus. Okay, Memorial Stadium, with its great limestone horseshoe and the majestic palace, palace towers and such. If you looked at the entrance there, the base of the horseshoe where the Alumni Center sits today, that was to be the memorial entrance. Memorial Stadium, the memorial would have been placed right inside the archway. And as they walked in, witnessed the football, they would be constantly reminded that this was indeed a memorial as well. And for those of you who are kind of new to K-State or such, like I said, I was here in the 90s, I never called it Memorial Stadium. I only knew it as Old Stadium. There's a new football facility up the road. Well, Memorial Stadium was never finished. The memorial was never, the Memorial Hall entrance was never built. The memorial itself was never placed. The memorial was never dedicated. And these are not things that were intentional or a slight to someone. It was just the 1920s turned into the 1930s, the Great Depression, World War II. They ran out of money. Different things happened. They had a decision: do we build the Memorial Hall entrance, or do we enclose the east side of the stadium for these locker rooms that we've been promised for the last 10 years? And they said, well, we got to have the locker rooms. And then after the close of World War II, Memorial Stadium became a dormitory. And the men's side is on the east, the women's side on the west, and then flip-flop. But as it went through the rest of the way, you hear East Stadium and West Stadium. When it became a place to live, it needed a new identity, and people kind of lost track of what that stadium was built for to begin with. And as I said, the stadium's never finished. So the memorial's never been finished as well. Next, please. And this is kind of how the stadium looked for many, many years. When I was a student here, the Alumni Center wasn't there. Certainly the beautiful Bernie Family Welcome Center wasn't placed in there. And it was just kind of an old, forgotten part of campus. And if we get the next one, please. And yet, there has been a memorial. And I think every one of you should recognize this as it sits today in General Myers Hall, right on your hallway there. And next time you guys walk by, I hope you take a closer look. I hope you kind of try to find out some of these different people. Try to find Willis Comfort, try to find George Wingate. Each one of these guys has a story. Each one of these guys contributed something to our great fabric of American history. But this wall was built as the original memorial. And it was built in Seton Hall, stayed there for several years. As soon as we'll finish the Memorial Stadium, it will be placed where it belongs. And then it became clear that, hey, the stadium is it's not ever going to get finished. So they took it from Seton Hall, they brought it into Anderson Hall. And there was a place there, a recreation center, recreation hall, it's kind of the forerunner to the student union. And it was placed on that place and stayed there for many, many, many years. And then they remodeled, they built the student union after the Second World War. They remodeled the Anderson Hall, it became part of an office. And for many years, this was sitting in Anderson Hall, overlooking the admissions department. Until somebody said, those eyes kind of freak me out a little bit. I don't like to see that. And so they purchased a drape, heavy, thick drape, put it over the memorial. And that's where that stayed for several, many more years, I want to say in the 1970s. Guy came in and remodeled again, gets a new office, he looks behind the drape, hey, that's kind of cool, puts it out, but it was just, it was a kind of forgotten memorial. And then again, through another remodeling, it was moved once more and finally made its way to its rightful place in Memorial Stadium. Unfortunately, it was placed there and turned, with the images to the wall, kind of leaned up against underneath the stadium, just forgotten. And right around the year 2000, while it was an ROTC detachment or whatnot that was out on the parade ground out there doing their Saturday morning PT, and they didn't really have the finest restroom facilities at the time or whatnot, and one guy's kind of goes in and he's relieving himself, and he's like, I wonder what this is. He looks around. It was at that moment that it was rediscovered again, that it was brought back, or for the first time, brought to General Myers Hall, stayed there in the basement for about 2 years while students, you guys yourselves, your predecessors, refinished it, repolished it, put it back up, and now it has a permanent, hopefully semi-permanent place in Richard Myers Hall. But it's something, like I said, when I finally found this and came back and saw this face-to-face for the first time, it's a real riveting moment. I'd like to tell you, of all the things that your battalion has been responsible for and been extremely proud of, this might be one of your finest accomplishments. And that's saying quite a bit because there's quite a few, rock and roll stars out of your crowd here. But that's the memorial. And it's never been placed where it rightfully belongs. Can we get the next slide, please? And yet here we have, this stadium been trying to be knocked down since the 80s. They eventually, at one point they wanted to turn this into a parking garage. And they found out, we can't really tear it down because it is actually a memorial. And so they had to design, one of the craziest graphics you'll ever see, was they put the parking garage in the middle of the stadium. And thankfully somebody 86 that idea, and they didn't do that. And, but as the years went on, year 2000, the Alumni Center takes over some of the property. Bernie Family Welcome Center was put in, the Purple Mass Theater moves over. The new turf was put in about 16 years ago. And this stadium now has a brand new life, a new purpose. And it truly is, a student facility. I think outside of the library and the student union, perhaps, it's one of the most heavily used facilities by the Kansas State student population today. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. But it's unfinished. Okay, as I said, the stadium was never dedicated. The memorial was never officially placed. And these are things that the 48 Fallen and 48 Found Project is committed to change, because when we got the clearance to do this, April 8th, 2017, 100 years plus a day from the American Declaration of War, the stadium, Kansas State University, will be formally dedicated as the Memorial Stadium, World War I Memorial, it was always intended to be. And we get the next slide, please. And I don't know where that memorial is going to go. I kind of like this little side of it here, but like I said, I don't make those decisions. But the important thing to remember is that, yes, this story, the 48 Fallen, but it's the 48 Found. And yes, we lost a little bit of our history. We didn't, fulfill the obligation that we pledged to do in the 1920s. But I don't see that as being a negative. I don't see it as being a detriment to our reputation, to our personality, to our culture here at Kansas State. Because as I kind of understand it, as I see this project, it's almost that it required 100 years for it to reach its natural conclusion. And so as we go forward into the spring, and I want you to hear more about this. I want you guys to, certainly get in touch with me if you need to do a class project, anything like that. The 48 Fallen, 48 Found is our story. It's K-State's story. But through K-State's story, we have been given a national treasure that for the first time finally explores and tells the tale of the American experience in the First World War. And if I get the last slide, please. And so I'd like to close the presentation a little bit. This is a plaque from another monument, not too far away, dedicated to another war not too long ago. But it's out of Fort Riley. And I took this picture, and again, I take a lot of pictures, I don't look at them until kind of go, oh yeah, that was actually pretty good. But there's something about this that I really find fitting for what we're talking about, because the young dead soldiers do not speak. They have a silence that speaks for them at night. They say, we have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done. They say whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope, or for nothing, we cannot say it is you who must say this. They say, we leave our deaths, give them their meaning. We were young, they say, we have died. Remember us. And I kind of like to think it's almost like the 48 Fallen speaking through this plaque. Just as every memorial, means more than just the statue that it is, it's what it represents. And it's our collective past that binds us together and reminds us that we are truly the United States of America. And again, as I said, the gift of the 48 Fallen, it's 100 years in the making, but they've finally been able to peel the curtain back and show us what the American experience was in the First World War. And so I thank you very, very much for the opportunity to share a little brief with that. I think we've got some time for some questions if you mind, but thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to be patient, to listen to the story that I've shared with you today. 48 Fallen, 48 Found. It's a K-State story. Thank you. Don't all ask at once. Yes?
Some of the photographs show members of the Navy. Is there any unique stories that came about?
And that's another, I'm glad you brought that up, because of all the 48 Fallen, they served in each branch of the service. In the Navy, the Marines, the Signal Corps, there were a couple of aviators in there, the foundation of the Air Force. So the Navy guys themselves, unfortunately, they all died from illness. And so one of them was in Seattle, one of them was on the East Coast and outside of Norfolk, Virginia, but each one of them was taken down by the influenza pandemic. Actually, I take that back. 2 of them died of the influenza pandemic. The third had enlisted in the Navy and did not know how to swim and told his buddies out by Alma. He said, hey, we better figure out, if I'm joining the Navy, I better figure out how to go swim. So they went into a farm pond outside Alma, and William Cleveland went down and he never came up. And unfortunately, that's one story that he drowned. But that's the stories of the Navies, unfortunately. Anything else? What you got there, Austin?
How did you find the information about as far as the Siberian expedition? Because Russian archives don't have that.
Well, I'll tell you, it was a. Ernest Dorland, I found this little connection that he was a member of the 27th Infantry Regiment. The Wolfhound. So I started going back. I couldn't find anything on Ernest Dorland. I'm like, all right, let me try this around now. And I started finding the history of the 27th Infantry Regiment. And I'm like, my God, this is just crazy, because they become part of this Siberian expedition that goes over to, I won't get too complicated here, basically, the World War was a mess. And as Russia exited the war, they took with them a lot of prisoners of war that still wanted to get back in the fight, like 100,000. And obviously Germany was not going to let them go through German lines to fight on the Western Front. So the brilliant idea was, send all these guys on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. We'll get them over to Vladivostok and then ship them overseas, and eventually they'll get to France. And to do that, they organized an international organization, basically, of several militaries, British, Japanese, Koreans, and they were to protect the railroad. And that's why Ernest Dorland gets over there. But the involvement while he's over there, they realize that, my God, they're involved in the Russian Civil War. And the Russian Civil War was fought, through Siberia with these armored trains. There's such a story, such proportion. I'm like, this is baloney. There's no way. Like, it's fascinating, but there's no way I can connect Ernest Dorland with this. And then I read a diary where they have mentioned Ernest Dorland, that was given the task as a lieutenant to cross overland to attack this Chinese or Russian boat or something like this. And they make this massive, 50 miles overland through the swamps, just horrific. The boat's gone. But when they go back, and to this day, supposedly, this is still one of the longest, this is like the metric that the overland infantry is still gauged by, because they covered something in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 miles in like 11 hours. And that became known as the Dorland Expedition. He was the leader of that group. And I don't know if he was a great outdoorsy guy or he was just sick of the mosquitoes and whatnot, like we're getting back to camp. But that was the connection that actually tied Ernest Dorland himself to that 27th Infantry and to the Siberian Expedition. And that story, like I said, is worthy of a Hollywood movie, because you think of armored trains, so what does that mean? Well, think of something out of the Lord of the Rings almost, with cannons sticking out the sides, and that's how these guys used to fight the war. So, but yeah, the 27th Infantry is a very, very fascinating story in its own right. Anybody else? What you got?
How many of the grave sites did you visit?
Thus far, I've been to about 23. So there's still about 15 I need to get to in France. So that's one of these days, maybe K-State will hit us up. We'll all go to France, go visit the graves and whatnot. But there's still quite a few buried in France, and there's one in California, one in Virginia that I haven't seen, and the rest are basically here in Kansas. So, and that's some of them, the bodies were never found. And you read the stories of the missing in action, read the letters and such, and so there are some guys where there's just simply nothing left. But their families erected monuments, throughout Kansas to some of those, and so I count those as, as part of it. But that project on its own has been, fascinating in its own right, because these old graves tell the story themselves, and you really see the sense of loss. There's one guy on here, Lester Hannaway. He's buried in this little tiny graveyard up in Jewell, Kansas, and it's out in the middle of, God's Kansas. And right next to his marble stone is that of his brother. And you see the two of them, neither one of them made it through the war. And so there's, like I said, the story, the graves themselves tell the story. So, anything else? Sure. All right, I guess we're getting south. Hey, once again, I really appreciate that.
We'd like to, coming out, I'll let you us on our, appreciate last year, and like, we did this to. Hey, all right. Thank you so much. Give us another round of applause. Sorry, get on over. To the side. Go. Warm up.